March 4th, 1971. Queens, New York. The diner is quiet at this hour. Vinyl booths. Cigarette haze. A cup of coffee going cold. She walks in at 7:14 a.m. No bodyguard. No weapon visible. Just a woman in a wool coat, dark hair pinned back, carrying a leather attach case like she's late for a business meeting. She orders nothing. 12 minutes later, she walks out. 40 seconds after that, the man sitting in the corner booth, a mid-level captain in the Lucchese crime family, slumps forward, face into the table. Coffee spreading like a dark tide across the Formica. No gunshot. No struggle. No witnesses who'll talk. The medical examiner will spend 3 days ruling out natural causes. He never finds what he's looking for, because what killed Anthony Crea that morning wasn't a bullet. It was a name. A signature on a document he'd signed 6 months earlier. A financial agreement he didn't fully understand, because the woman who drafted it understood it far better than he ever would. The FBI field agent assigned to the scene writes one line in his preliminary report. Subject may have had female associate. Purpose unknown. Purpose unknown. That 3-word dismissal will cost the Bureau 11 years. Because she wasn't an associate. She was the operation. Her name was Karen Friedman Pauley, though, by the time federal prosecutors finally typed it into an indictment. She had been operating for nearly 2 decades under 4 different identities, 3 business registrations, and an accounting firm whose legitimate clients included 2 sitting congressmen and a Catholic diocese in Brooklyn. That is where you must begin. Not with the crime, with the formation. Karen was born in 1941 in Flatbush, Brooklyn, the second daughter of a Jewish accountant who worked 12-hour days and kept 2 sets of books for reasons he never explained to his children. Her father, Morris Friedman, was not a violent man. He was something the mob would later find far more useful. He was precise, methodical, a man who understood that the most dangerous number in any financial document is not the largest one, it is the one that doesn't belong. She learned that at age 9. By 16, she was completing his client reconciliations while he slept, not because he asked, because she found it interesting in the way other girls found film stars interesting as a system with patterns, pressure points, and hidden architecture. She enrolled at Brooklyn College in 1959. Accounting and economics. She was one of 4 women in her cohort. The professors addressed questions to the men. She graduated top of her class and received no job offers from any of the 16 firms she applied to. This is not a biographical footnote. This is the mechanism. The legitimate world, the world of mahogany offices and firm handshakes and quarterly reports, told Karen Friedman, in language both formal and unmistakable, that her competence had a ceiling. That precision and intelligence in a woman's hands were decorative qualities, admirable at a dinner party, inadmissible in a boardroom. The mob had no such policy. She met Henry Pauley in 1962 at a social function in Bensonhurst, a wedding, as these introductions so often are. Henry was peripheral, a driver, occasionally a numbers runner, a man whose primary value to the Lucchese family was his complete reliability and his complete mediocrity. He would never rise. Everyone in that room understood that, including Karen. What she saw in Henry Pauley was not a husband in the conventional sense. She saw a door that was already open. They married in November of that year. Within 18 months, Karen had quietly assumed management of Henry's small cash-front business, a linen supply company servicing restaurants across Queens and southern Brooklyn. Within 3 years, that company was processing a volume of cash that bore no relationship to the number of tablecloths being laundered. The capos noticed. Not Karen, they didn't notice Karen. They noticed that Henry Pauley's operation had suddenly become clean, efficient, and invisible to auditors. They assumed Henry had found religion, or discipline, or a better accountant. He had found all 3. They were the same person. and she was watching everything. This is the portrait the FBI spent 11 years failing to construct. Not a gun mole, not a mob wife, not a woman who loved a dangerous man and paid the price. Karen Friedman Pauley was a financial intelligence operating inside a criminal hierarchy that was constitutionally incapable of recognizing her as a threat, because it was constitutionally incapable of recognizing her at all. That invisibility was not her vulnerability. It was her entire strategy. By 1965, the Lucchese family was facing a problem that no amount of violence could solve. Money, not the absence of it. They had plenty. The problem was its movement, cash generated from numbers running, loan sharking, and labor racketeering was accumulating faster than the family's existing infrastructure could absorb and legitimize it. The R's had begun targeting high-profile organized crime figures following the Vodike hearings of 1963. Scrutiny was intensifying, and the men at the top of the family, men who understood power in terms of territory, loyalty, and force, were suddenly confronting a financial architecture problem that their instincts were entirely unsuited to solve. They needed someone who could make money disappear, not physically. Structurally, Karen had been watching this problem develop for 2 years. She did not volunteer a solution. That would have been noticed, and not favorably. Instead, she worked through Henry. A suggestion here, a quiet correction there, a restructuring of one laundering channel that reduced exposure by 40% and increased throughput by nearly double. When the capos asked Henry how he'd managed it, Henry told them he'd consulted a private accountant. Technically accurate. The accountant began receiving more complex problems. By 1967, Karen was managing financial flows for 3 separate Lucchese operations, all routed through her linen company, a newly incorporated import-export firm registered in her maiden name, and a third entity that existed, on paper, as a florist supply wholesaler in Staten Island. None of these companies shared a visible ownership trail. None of them appeared, to any surface-level examination, to be connected to each other. This was not accidental complexity. It was engineered opacity. What Karen had constructed was, in modern financial terminology, a layering system, the intermediate stage of money laundering, in which illicit funds are moved through a series of transactions specifically designed to obscure their origin. In 1967, that terminology didn't yet exist in federal law enforcement vocabulary. The Bank Secrecy Act wouldn't pass until 1970. The legal architecture for prosecuting financial crime of this sophistication was still being drafted by people who had not yet encountered someone operating at her level. She was ahead of the law by approximately a decade, but the structural achievement was only half of what made Karen Friedman Pauley genuinely dangerous. The other half was her understanding of human psychology inside a criminal organization. The Mafia runs on loyalty enforced by fear. Every man in that hierarchy understands at some cellular level that his position is contingent on performance, on silence, on the goodwill of men above him. That anxiety is constant and largely unspoken. It shapes every conversation, every transaction, every favor asked and granted. Karen understood this anxiety better than most made men did. She used it. When a capo named Vincent Albanese began skimming from a numbers operation she was processing, she didn't report it upward. She documented it. Quietly, completely, then she restructured his reporting channel in a way that made his skim visible to exactly one person herself, and invisible to everyone above him. She now held a detailed record of his theft, and he didn't know she held it. She never used it directly. She didn't need to. Albanese, who didn't know precisely what she knew but sensed that she knew something, became one of her most cooperative clients. He processed his cash through her channels without complaint, without negotiation, and without the territorial friction that characterized most of her other working relationships. This pattern repeated itself across multiple figures over the following 4 years. She was not building a criminal empire in the traditional sense. She was not accumulating territory or commanding soldiers. She was building something more durable and more dangerous. She was building indispensability. And beneath indispensability, almost invisible even to herself at first, she was building leverage. By 1969, there were senior figures in the Lucchese family who could not have accurately described what she looked like. They knew her as a name, passed through Henry, an arrangement that worked, a channel that didn't leak. In an organization defined by visibility, by the performance of power, the public display of hierarchy, Karen Friedman Pauley had achieved something almost paradoxical. She had become essential by becoming invisible. And in the Mafia, as in all power structures, the most dangerous position is not the one everyone is watching. It is the one no one thinks to watch at all. There is a moment in every criminal career, rarely recognized in real time, when a person crosses from participant to architect, from someone inside the system to someone the system cannot function without. For Karen Friedman Pauley, that moment arrived in the winter of 1969. And it arrived not through ambition, through catastrophe. On December 11th, 1969, federal agents raided 3 Lucchese-connected businesses in Queens simultaneously. The operation, coordinated between the FBI and the newly restructured Organized Crime Strike Force, was the most aggressive federal action against the family in nearly a decade. 12 men were arrested. 4 indictments followed within the week. 2 of those indicted were senior figures who controlled the primary cash consolidation points for the family's Queens operations. The financial pipeline, years in construction, carefully maintained, went silent overnight. The family had cash sitting in 12 different locations with no safe channel to move it. They had obligations to union officials, to politicians on retainer, to rival families who had extended credit arrangements. They had payroll because even criminal organizations have payroll, and no mechanism to process it. Without triggering the very scrutiny, the arrests had already elevated to critical levels. The men at the top did what men at the top of the Lucchese family always did when confronted with a problem requiring subtlety. They panicked quietly and waited for someone else to solve it. Karen solved it in 11 days. Working through Henry, she proposed a complete restructuring of the cash movement architecture, not a repair of the existing system, which was now compromised, but a wholesale replacement. She introduced a cell-based model in which no single point of the network held knowledge of more than one adjacent node. If any individual component was surveilled or flipped, the damage would be contained. The whole could not be inferred from any single part. This was not a concept she had borrowed from criminal precedent. There was no criminal precedent at this sophistication level in 1969. She had derived it independently from her reading of post-war European intelligence literature, specifically declassified analyses of resistance cell structures used in occupied France during the Second World War. She had been reading toward this problem for years without knowing precisely what problem she was reading toward. The family implemented her model within 3 weeks. It held for 7 years without a single financial prosecution. After that, there was no more rooting through Henry. Not entirely. The senior figures, men who had spent their careers refusing to conduct serious business with anyone they hadn't known for 20 years, began making an exception. A quiet one. An exception they didn't formally acknowledge or discuss. The way men of that world rarely formally acknowledge the things that matter most to them. They came to her directly. This was the turning point, and it was also the trap, though she understood that better than anyone. Indispensability in a criminal organization is not job security. It is exposure. Every additional piece of knowledge she absorbed, every additional operation she touched, every additional name she learned became simultaneously an asset and a liability. The more essential she became, the more dangerous she became to the family as a potential federal witness, and the more dangerous they became to her. She understood this calculus precisely. So, she built insurance, not of the kind that could be seized in a raid or subpoenaed by a federal grand jury. Over the course of 1970 and into 1971, Karen began constructing a secondary archive, a parallel documentation of family financial operations, stored not in any office or safety deposit box, but across a network of individuals who held individual pieces without understanding what those pieces comprised. It was the same cell structure she had designed for the family's cash movement, applied now to her own survival. This is what separated Karen Friedman Pauley from every other financial operator the Lucchese family had ever used, and from the popular mythology of the mob wife who knew too much. She didn't simply know too much. She had designed a situation in which acting against her would trigger consequences that no one in the family could fully map in advance. She had made herself not just indispensable, she had made herself costly to remove. There is a particular kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself, that works patiently, structurally, without the need for recognition or display. The Mafia had always relied on the assumption that this kind of intelligence lived only in certain kinds of men. By the winter of 1970, one woman had quietly proven that assumption catastrophically wrong, and the family, in its pride and its blindness, still did not fully see it. To understand what happened next, you must understand what America looked like in 1971. The Nixon administration had inherited a federal law enforcement apparatus that was, for the first time in its institutional history, genuinely committed to dismantling organized crime. Not selectively. Systematically, the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970 had passed with broad congressional support, creating the RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a legal instrument so expansive, so structurally aggressive, that it would eventually reshape the entire architecture of federal prosecution. RICO changed everything. Before it, prosecutors had to prove individual criminal acts, individual defendants, individual transactions. The Mafia's cell-based compartmentalization, the very model Karen had refined and implemented, was specifically designed to defeat that approach. You could prosecute a soldier without touching a capo. You could indict a capo without reaching the administration. The organization survived its losses because the law could only attack it one node at a time. RICO allowed prosecutors to attack the entire network as a single criminal enterprise. Suddenly, Karen's architecture, brilliant against the old legal framework, had a vulnerability it had never faced before. Because RICO didn't require prosecutors to prove who pulled a trigger or moved a specific envelope of cash. It required them to prove a pattern of racketeering activity and an association, in fact, enterprise. Pattern, enterprise, association, three words that made the cell structure not a shield, but a map. Karen understood this before most of the family's legal counsel did. She had read the statute in full within 2 weeks of its passage. She had annotated it. She had begun, quietly and without instruction, modeling the family's exposure under its provisions. What she found was not reassuring. But the RICO problem, severe as it was not the most immediate crisis of 1971. The most immediate crisis had a name, a congressional district, and an increasingly complicated relationship with the Lucchese family's investment portfolio. Congressman Gerald Moran, a 3-term Democrat representing a district in Queens, had been on the family's informal payroll since 1964, not in any crude, envelope, under-the-table sense. The arrangement was sophisticated. Moran's campaign infrastructure received donations through a network of legitimate-appearing political action committees, several of which were capitalized through shell entities that Karen managed. In return, Moran exercised influence over zoning decisions, city contract allocations, and critically the composition of a state-level oversight committee. that monitored the very industries the family used as laundering infrastructure. It was a clean arrangement, professionally maintained, financially invisible. Until Moran decided he wanted to run for Senate. A Senate campaign required a different scale of scrutiny. Opposition research. Federal campaign finance filings examined by people whose entire professional purpose was finding exactly the kind of anomalies that Karen had spent a decade learning to conceal. Moran's people came to the family quietly in the spring of 1971 with a request that was framed as a mutual interest, but was, in its operational reality, an ultimatum. Clean up the paper trail or Moran would begin the process of distancing himself in ways that would raise questions neither party wanted raised. This was not a negotiation. This was a man who had taken 10 years of the family's money, deciding that the relationship had become inconvenient. The family's instinctive response was violence. It was always violence. There were serious discussions conducted in the careful elliptical language these men used for serious discussions about whether Gerald Moran presented a problem that required a permanent solution. Karen intervened. Not emotionally, not morally. Strategically, she presented a counter-analysis, a sitting congressman's disappearance or sudden death in 1971. In the current federal climate, under the current administration's organized crime mandate, would not end scrutiny. It would concentrate it. Every financial connection between Moran's office and any entity even peripherally linked to the family would be forensically examined within weeks. The very paper trail they were attempting to manage would become the centerpiece of a federal task force with unlimited resources and enormous political motivation. Killing Moran, she argued, was the most expensive option available. She proposed an alternative. Over the following 6 weeks, Karen executed a financial restructuring of Moran's entire contribution history, not an erasure, which was impossible, but a recontextualization. Donations were traced back through legitimate business entities with genuine operational histories. Timing discrepancies were addressed through amended filings attributed to clerical error. 2 of the Shell P8s were dissolved in a manner that generated paperwork, suggesting routine organizational consolidation rather than deliberate concealment. It was, by any technical measure, a masterwork. Moran ran for Senate. He lost in the primary. The family's exposure from the connection was reduced to a level that no subsequent investigation ever successfully prosecuted. But something had shifted in the room during those weeks. The senior figures had watched Karen navigate a political crisis that their instincts had wanted to solve with a body, and she had solved it with a filing cabinet. They were grateful. They were also, for the first time, genuinely unsettled, because the same mind that had just protected them from federal exposure was also the mind that knew more about their operations than anyone currently drawing breath. Gratitude and fear in the Mafia have always occupied the same room. And in that room, in the spring of 1971, the temperature had quietly begun to change. There is a specific silence that precedes betrayal in a criminal organization. It is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of subtraction, of phone calls that come slightly less frequently, of meetings where certain names are no longer mentioned, of small courtesies that evaporate so gradually that the person being isolated cannot identify the precise moment the temperature changed. Karen felt it in the summer of 1971. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury she had never permitted herself. Instead, she did what she always did when the environment shifted. She observed, catalogued, and began constructing a response before the threat had fully declared itself. What she was observing was this. In the aftermath of the Moran situation, the family's acting underboss, a calculating, methodical man named Raymond Castelletti, had begun conducting a quiet internal audit of his own. Not financial, operational, he was mapping, with the patience of someone who understood patience as a weapon, exactly how much Karen Friedman Pauley knew, exactly how many operations she touched, and exactly how many of those operations would be compromised if she were ever to sit across a table from a federal prosecutor. The answer to all three questions was the same: too much. Castelletti was not an emotional man. He had not arrived at his position through violence alone. He had arrived through the same quality that Karen possessed: the ability to think structurally rather than reactively. In another world, they might have recognized each other as professional equals. In this world, he had reached a straightforward conclusion. She had become a liability that outweighed her utility. But Castelletti was also intelligent enough to recognize the problem her own intelligence presented. Karen had not constructed her insurance archive for sentimental reasons. She had constructed it because she understood that the moment would come when the family would perform exactly this calculation. The archive was not leverage she would ever deploy offensively. It was a deterrent, a guarantee of mutually assured destruction, sophisticated enough that any rational actor would hesitate before triggering it. Castelletti hesitated. Instead, he chose a slower approach. Surgical, almost elegant in its patience. He began redirecting financial operations away from Karen's channels, not abruptly, which would have signaled intent, but gradually, over a period of months, routing new business through alternative structures while allowing her existing arrangements to continue undisturbed. The goal was attrition. Reduce her operational footprint. Reduce her current knowledge base. Wait until her archive represented history rather than active exposure. Then act. It was a sound strategy. Karen identified it within 6 weeks. She identified it not through surveillance or informants, but through the financial data itself, the same data she had been reading for a decade. Volume anomalies. Routing patterns that didn't follow operational logic. New shell structures appearing in adjacent territory that bore the stylistic fingerprints of her own methodology, implemented by someone who had clearly studied her architecture and was now attempting to replicate it without her. She was being replaced before she was being removed. This intelligence clarified everything. It also placed her in the most dangerous position she had yet occupied, because responding directly would confirm that she had detected the maneuver, which would accelerate the timeline. Responding indirectly required resources and relationships outside the family structure, and reaching outside the family structure in 1971 meant one of a very small number of options. One of those options was the FBI. She did not go to the FBI. Not yet. Not directly. What she did was considerably more precise. She identified a mid-level agent in the FBI's New York field office, a man named Robert Ackerman, who had been building an organized crime case for 3 years and was, by every professional measure, running out of time to produce results before his supervisors reassigned his resources. She did not contact Ackerman. She did something more surgical. Through a carefully constructed chain of intermediaries, she arranged for Ackerman to receive a single document, an internal financial summary, that revealed enough about one specific Lucchese operation to be genuinely valuable, and nothing about Karen Friedman Pauley whatsoever. Ackerman's investigation suddenly had new momentum. The family, watching federal attention shift toward a specific operation Karen had already begun quietly withdrawing from, assumed the leak had come from within that operation. 3 men were suspected. 2 were demoted. 1 left New York permanently under circumstances that were never formally investigated. None of them had leaked anything. Karen had redirected federal attention like a current, not toward herself, not away from herself, but toward a specific pressure point that served her immediate strategic purpose, while leaving no fingerprints that could be traced in any direction. But Henry was watching. Henry Pauley Peripheral, mediocre, reliable Henry, had spent 9 years watching his wife become something he didn't have the vocabulary to describe. He was not unintelligent. He understood, in the approximate way that men understand things they would prefer not to examine directly, that Karen's position had long since superseded his own. that his name on the business registrations was a legal convenience, that the capos who occasionally called the house and asked for Karen, then caught themselves and asked for him, were performing a fiction that no longer served any practical purpose. Henry was frightened, not of Karen, of what would happen to Karen, and frightened men, in the orbit of the Mafia, make the most dangerous kind of miscalculation, not the calculated betrayal of ambition, but the panicked betrayal of love, the kind that believes it is acting protectively, and in doing so destroys the very thing it is attempting to protect. In September of 1971, Henry Pauley had a conversation he should not have had, with a man he should not have trusted, about a woman who had spent a decade ensuring that no one in that world fully understood what she was. He told them enough, not everything, but in the architecture Karen had constructed, enough was sufficient. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. This silence had a direction. October 14th, 1971, a Tuesday. Karen Friedman Pauley left her home in Forest Hills at 8:40 in the morning. She carried the leather attach case she always carried. She wore the wool coat she always wore in autumn. She took the same route she always took toward the offices of Friedman Financial Consulting on Jamaica Avenue, a route she had deliberately varied 3 times in the preceding month, and then returned to deliberately, because returning to pattern after varying it was itself a signal she had decided to send. She knew they were watching. She had known for 11 days. What happened on October 14th, 1971, was not a murder. This is the fact that confounded the FBI for years afterward, and the fact that makes Karen Friedman Pauley's story genuinely singular in the annals of organized crime. The Lucchese family did not kill her. They could not kill her, not safely, not cleanly, not without triggering the archive she had spent 2 years constructing and distributing. Castelletti had finally accepted this. So instead, they did something that required more patience, more coordination, and in certain ways more sophistication than a killing. They erased her. Not physically, professionally, legally, socially. The operation had been prepared over 6 weeks with a precision that bore, in its architecture, the unmistakable influence of Karen's own methodology, because Castelletti had in fact been studying her methods for months. He had learned well. He had learned from the best available teacher. And now he was applying those lessons against their source. It began with the businesses. Over the course of a single working day, 3 separate legal actions were filed in 3 separate jurisdictions. The linen company, the original foundation of Karen's financial infrastructure, was the subject of a civil fraud complaint filed by a former employee, a man Karen had never met, whose testimony had been carefully prepared, and whose legal fees were being paid through channels entirely invisible to any surface examination. The import-export firm was served with a tax lien originating from an amended filing that had been quietly submitted to the R's 6 weeks earlier, an amendment that introduced specific numerical discrepancies into Karen's records. Discrepancies she had not introduced, inserted by someone with sufficient access to her bookkeeping systems to make them appear authentic. The third entity, the florist supply wholesaler, simply ceased to exist. Its registration was formally dissolved that morning by its registered agent, a name on paper who had never set foot in Staten Island, and who had signed the dissolution documents 3 weeks prior without fully understanding what he was signing. In one day, the legal architecture Karen had spent 9 years constructing was simultaneously attacked from 3 directions by 3 different legal mechanisms in 3 different jurisdictions. She arrived at her office on Jamaica Avenue to find the locks changed. Inside, her filing systems had been removed. Not ransacked, removed. Methodically, every physical document that represented her current operational knowledge, the records she maintained on site, was gone. taken overnight by people who knew precisely what they were looking for, because they had been told precisely what they were looking for. Henry had told them more than enough. She stood on the pavement outside that office for 4 minutes. A witness, a dry cleaner operating from the adjacent storefront, would later describe a woman standing very still, attached case in hand, looking at a locked door with an expression he struggled to characterize. Not distress, he said, not anger, something more deliberate than either, like someone confirming a calculation they had already completed. She walked to a payphone 2 blocks east. She made a single call, lasting 90 seconds. The number she dialed has never been formally identified. Then she walked to the subway and went home. What followed over the next 72 hours constituted the actual execution not of Karen, but of everything she had built inside the Lucchese family's world. The civil complaint generated immediate press coverage in 2 Queens-based newspapers, framing her as the operator of a fraudulent bookkeeping scheme targeting small businesses. The tax lien became a matter of public record. 2 of the legitimate clients whose accounts she had managed, including a city councilman, whose financial relationship with her firm had always been entirely above board, immediately and publicly terminated their association. Reputation, in Karen's world, was operational infrastructure. Without it, she could not function. Without function, her knowledge became historical rather than active, and historical knowledge, Castelletti had calculated, did not justify the risk of the archive. It was a cold, precise, and in its way deeply impressive piece of work. It also failed. Not immediately, not visibly, but in the way that strategies built on incomplete intelligence always fail at the exact point where the assumption diverges from the reality. Castelletti had assumed the archive was Karen's only insurance. He had forgotten or never fully understood that Karen Friedman Pauly's most valuable asset had never been documentation. It was memory. 11 years of transactions, names, dates, routing structures, political arrangements, the specific language used in conversations that had taken place in rooms with no recording devices, between men who believed themselves entirely unobserved. Karen carried all of it, organized and indexed, in a mind that had been performing at this level since she was 9 years old, reconciling her father's books at the kitchen table in Flatbush. They had taken her files. They had not taken her. And on the 73rd day following October 14th, 1971, a date she had chosen, with the same deliberateness she brought to everything Karen Friedman Pauly, walked into the offices of the FBI's New York Field Division and asked to speak with Special Agent Robert Ackerman. She sat down across the table from him. She opened the attach case. Inside was not a document, not a file, not a recording. It was a yellow legal pad, and on it, in her precise accountant's handwriting, was the opening summary of what would become one of the most significant organized crime cooperations in the history of the New York field office. She had written it from memory, every word of it. Robert Ackerman would later describe the first meeting as the most disorienting professional experience of his career. Not because of what Karen said, because of how she said it. She did not arrive frightened. She did not arrive vengeful. She did not perform the emotional theater that federal agents had come to expect from cooperative witnesses, the trembling hands. The conditional loyalty, the carefully rationed disclosures designed to maintain personal leverage through manufactured uncertainty. These were the behaviors of people who had been broken into cooperation, people whose defection was reactive, emotional, born from fear or abandonment, or the sudden, clarifying terror of a prison sentence. Karen Friedman Pauly had not been broken into anything. She had made a decision, structured it, timed it, and arrived to execute it with the same professional composure she had brought to every other operation in her career. Ackerman, a 20-year Bureau veteran, who had sat across from some of the most significant organized crime figures of his generation, later told a colleague privately that within 30 minutes of that first session, he had understood something that fundamentally reframed his understanding of the case he had been building for 3 years. He had not been investigating the Lucchese family's financial operations. He had been investigating Karen's financial operations. The family had been inside them. The distinction was not semantic. It meant that the architecture he had been attempting to map from the outside the shell companies, the layering structures, the political contribution networks, the cell-based cash movement system, had been designed by the person now sitting across the table from him, which meant she didn't need to be asked the right questions. She already knew which questions mattered and precisely what the answers were. The formal cooperation agreement was executed in January 1972. What followed was not a single prosecution. It was a cascade. Over the next 3 years, Karen provided testimony and documentary reconstruction, the latter entirely from memory. Subsequently verified against physical evidence the Bureau had held for years without understanding its significance that formed the evidentiary foundation for 14 federal indictments. The targets ranged from street-level operations to senior family administration. Raymond Castelletti, the man who had engineered her professional erasure with such cold precision, was indicted in 1973 on RICO charges that included conspiracy, financial fraud, and labor racketeering. He was convicted in 1975 and sentenced to 18 years. He served 11. The political dimension of Karen's testimony produced the most acute institutional discomfort. The financial reconstruction of the Moran Contribution Network, the same network she had spent 6 weeks sanitizing in 1971, was now reconstructed in the opposite direction, with equal precision, for federal prosecutors. Gerald Moran, by then a failed Senate candidate, returned to his congressional seat, was not indicted. The Justice Department's calculation, never publicly explained, appeared to weigh the prosecutorial value of the financial evidence against the political cost of indicting a sitting congressman during an election cycle already destabilized by Watergate. Moran quietly declined to seek re-election in 1974. He cited health concerns. 2 of the PAC administrators connected to his campaign financing were convicted on separate federal charges. The connection to the Lucchese family was established in court documents, but never became the subject of sustained public scrutiny buried in the procedural complexity of the broader RICO prosecutions, reported in the back sections of newspapers whose front pages were consumed entirely by the unraveling of the Nixon presidency. History, as it often does, hid the most significant details in plain sight. Henry Pauley was not prosecuted. This decision, more than any other in the case, reveals the Bureau's lingering institutional discomfort, with the full implications of what Karen's cooperation had demonstrated. Henry was a marginal figure. Legally speaking, his operational role had been nominal for years, and the evidentiary value of prosecuting him was negligible against the cost of the cooperation agreement's public narrative. But the decision not to prosecute him also served a quieter purpose. It allowed the Bureau to maintain, in its public accounting of the case, a framing in which Henry Pauley remained nominally central, the organized crime figure, the connection point, and Karen remained, even in her role as the government's most valuable witness, adjacent to that centrality rather than its source. Even in her cooperation, the Bureau could not fully bring itself to place her at the center of the story she had written. She was relocated under the Federal Witness Protection Program in 1974. Her new identity, her location, and the subsequent details of her life are sealed. There are researchers who have spent careers attempting to trace her afterward and found nothing which is, given everything we know about her capabilities, precisely what she would have intended. The Lucchese family's financial infrastructure The architecture she had designed and they had then attempted to replicate without her did not survive her cooperation intact. The cell-based model she had, pioneered so effective against the pre-RICO legal framework, proved navigable by prosecutors, who had, through Karen's testimony, a complete schematic of how it operated. Subsequent investigations throughout the mid to late 1970s used the structural understanding her cooperation had generated to prosecute not just Lucchese operations, but analogous systems in 3 other New York families. Her methodology outlasted her presence in that world. But now it was being used against the world that had produced it. There is a particular irony embedded in this fact that no subsequent Bureau report ever formally acknowledged. The most effective tool federal prosecutors developed for dismantling the financial infrastructure of the New York mob in the 1970s was built almost entirely on an understanding derived from the work of a woman the mob had dismissed, undermined, and ultimately attempted to erase. The weapon they used to take apart the machine was the machine's own designer. Ackerman retired from the Bureau in 1983. In a deposition taken years later in connection with an unrelated case, he was asked to identify the most significant cooperative witness he had worked with in his career. He paused for a long moment before answering. He did not give a name. He said only that the most significant witness he had ever worked with had understood the case better than he had before the first meeting was over. The deposition transcript does not record whether he smiled when he said it, but those who were present in the room said he did. There is a question that serious students of organized crime eventually arrive at, usually after years of studying the violence, the hierarchy, the rituals of loyalty and betrayal that define these worlds. The question is not who was the most powerful, not who was the most feared, not who accumulated the most territory, commanded the most soldiers, or held the most senior position in the most significant family. The question is, who understood the system most completely? Because power, in any human organization, ultimately belongs not to the person with the most force at their disposal, but to the person who most accurately perceives the architecture of the system they are operating inside, who sees not just the surface, the meetings, the money, the violence, but the underlying structure. The pressure points, the load-bearing assumptions, the places where the entire edifice rests on beliefs that have never been examined, because no one has ever needed to examine them. Karen Friedman Pauley saw all of it. She saw it from the beginning, from that kitchen table in Flatbush, where a 9-year-old girl learned that numbers contain hidden architecture that most people never think to look for. She saw it in Brooklyn College, where the legitimate world demonstrated its own structural assumptions with clinical clarity that competence in a woman's hands was admissible as decoration, but not as authority. She saw it in the Lucchese family's financial chaos of 1965, and in the legal revolution of RICO in 1970, and in Raymond Castelletti's patient, methodical move against her in 1971. She saw it every time. She responded to it every time. And she survived every time. This is the thesis this story has been building toward through 9 chapters and 30 years of American criminal history. Not that Karen Friedman Pauley was exceptional because she was a woman in the Mafia that framing, however superficially compelling, reduces her to a novelty, a curiosity defined by her deviation from expectation. She was exceptional because she was the most complete strategic intelligence the Lucchese family ever contained. And the tragedy, if tragedy is the correct word for something this structurally inevitable, is that the organization was constitutionally incapable of recognizing this fact until she had already decided to destroy it. The Mafia's fatal error was not greed. It was not violence. It was not the hubris of men who believed themselves untouchable. It was a category error. For decades, the most powerful criminal organizations in America operated on an assumption so deeply embedded that it functioned less like a belief and more like gravity, that women in their world occupied defined roles with defined limits. Wives, companions, peripheral figures who absorbed domestic consequences and maintained social appearances. The assumption was so total, so unexamined, that it shaped everything: who was watched, who was trusted, who was considered a threat, who was considered an asset, and, critically, who was considered capable of constituting both simultaneously. Karen didn't defeat that assumption through confrontation. She used it. Every year that the family failed to see her clearly was a year she spent learning their architecture more completely. Every dismissal was a year of operational freedom. Every conversation conducted in her presence by men who forgot or never considered that she was listening was intelligence. The very blindness that should have been her vulnerability was, in her hands, converted into a decade of uninterrupted access to the most sensitive operational knowledge in one of New York's most significant criminal organizations. She turned their limitation into her infrastructure. And when they finally moved against her, when Castelletti deployed her own methodology against her, with the cold precision of a man who had studied her work carefully, he made the one error she had anticipated, and he had not. He assumed that what made her dangerous was external, documented, seizable. He took her files, her businesses, her legal architecture, her professional reputation. He left her mind entirely intact. In the end, the Lucchese family was not brought down by an informant in the traditional sense, a frightened soldier, a compromised capo, a man who traded his loyalty for a reduced sentence and spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder in a suburb he'd never chosen. It was brought down, structurally and financially, by a woman who had designed its most sophisticated systems, and then, when the organization demonstrated that it could not ultimately transcend its own assumptions about who mattered, walked into a federal building and reconstructed those systems from memory with the same precision she had built them. She did not cooperate out of fear. She did not cooperate out of revenge. She cooperated because the Lucchese family had made a strategic error, had confused erasing her presence with eliminating her threat, and she responded to strategic errors the way she had always responded to them. She exploited them. Henry Hill has occupied the popular imagination of American organized crime for 50 years. His story, The Foot Soldier's Eye View, the intoxicating chaos of the life, the eventual terrified flight into protection, is genuinely compelling. It is the story of a man consumed by a world he was never equipped to fully understand. Karen Friedman Pauley's story is its structural opposite. It is the story of a woman who understood that world more completely than the men who built it, who operated inside it not from compulsion or romance or the gravitational pull of violence and money, but from a clear-eyed assessment that it was the only arena available to her that would not cap her intelligence at the ceiling the legitimate world had already installed. And when that arena turned against her, she dismantled it. Quietly, precisely, from memory. She was never the most famous figure in the room. She was always the most dangerous one. Somewhere in a city whose name is sealed in a federal document that will not be declassified in our lifetimes, there is a woman in her 80s who was once known as Karen Friedman Pauley. She has lived for 50 years now, inside an identity she did not choose, the final architecture imposed on her by the same institutional apparatus that spent 11 years failing to see her, and then spent the next 3 years needing her more than it had ever needed anyone. Whether she considers that justice, or irony, or simply the final data point in a very long calculation that is a question no federal document addresses. But if you have paid attention to everything this story has shown you about how her mind worked you already know the answer.